Hi, this is Brianne Smith at the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, and I just want to welcome you all to the webinar. We think it's important to have this webinar because of how important agendas are to our events in terms of prepping faculty and staff, coordinating your meeting logistics, and we also, for TA providers specifically under OVW, think it's important to work with your program specialist on finalizing your agenda in terms of submitting conference request forms. So I want to turn it over to Jennifer White, the Program Director for Curriculum Development and Program Design at Futures Without Violence.
Thank you so much, Alicia and Brianne. Hi, everyone. It is great to be here with you today. I am here on behalf of the TA to TA grant, but also on behalf of the Institute for Leadership and Education Development, which is a project of Futures Without Violence, and it is a project that is supported by the Office on Violence Against Women. As Brianne said, my name is Jen White, and I am the Program Director for Curriculum Development and Program Design for Futures. And in that role, I write an awful lot of agendas. So we are going to spend some time today talking about some processes that you can use to really think through what you want in your agendas so that they're as meaningful as possible. Before we do that, I'm going to go through our objectives. So as a result of this session, you will be better able to follow a process to craft agendas that are based on real need and rooted in objectives, identify the value of drafting agendas for all your meetings and workshops, and utilize the agenda development worksheet. So you will see down below in the pod that says materials that there are 4 handouts, actually I think there are 3 handouts that you can use to help you with this process. But the one that's most important for you to be able to reference today is the agenda development tool. There are also 2 other handouts that we've created for our ILED project. One is a handout on how to write learning objectives, and one is a handout on how to do a needs assessment. And a needs assessment is basically a process for thinking through what the needs are of a group of learners, so what your learning needs are or what your topic needs are for a meeting, so to speak. So those are the 3 handouts, but the one that we're going to reference actively today in this webinar is the agenda development tool. I will also have screenshots of that on the slide deck here, so if you can't for some reason open the agenda development worksheet tool while we're on the phone, then you can always look at it later and you can just reference the picture that we have on the slides. So we have a relatively small group today. I am curious, before we get really deep into the content, to know if any of you that are on today have been to an ILED program. If you can take a look at the top of your screen, there's a little guy up there with his hand raised, and you can click on the arrow there to answer. And you can raise your hand or you can hit agree if you have been to an ILED workshop. That's the Institute for Leadership and Education Development. Just curious if folks have participated. We have 4 different workshops that we do. We have a curriculum development workshop. We have a faculty development workshop. We have a facilitation skills workshop and a distance learning workshop. So just curious if any of you have been. Okay, I see a couple of people raising their hands over here. 2 people. Let's see. Yes, it looks like 2. Okay. So I would love to see you, many of you in person at one of our upcoming workshops. But the reason I raise that is because if you attend an ILED workshop, one of the things that you will here is a lot of talk around the processes for designing education or designing meetings. So we spend a lot of time thinking through how do we really think about what we need to accomplish in a meeting or in a workshop. What are the needs and really what are our objectives when we're either having a meeting or having some kind of conference. So that's some of what we do at ILED, and that's some of what we're going to do for you guys here today. So to start that off, we're going to do a poll. And the first poll is, do you use any process for developing a meeting or conference agenda? So either one. Okay. Okay. So I'm watching the poll results. And it's interesting because I expected actually for more people to say no, that they don't have a process for developing meeting or conference agendas. So I'm happy to see that about half of you guys are saying that you do. Does anyone anyone who said that they do have a process, want to write into the chat box anything about that process, what that process is like? See a couple of folks typing, so we'll just pause for a second, see if folks have any comments on what kind of process they use to develop an agenda. I always use the previous meetings minutes, so anything outstanding is addressed, and of course standing topics, great, okay, so that's one way. And Lou Marie wrote similarly that revisiting prior agendas, but also working together with the team to design the agenda, that's great. And I'll touch on a little bit about that in a minute, about this idea of working collaboratively. Items from the parking lot, so I think that means things that were not addressed at last meetings, probably. Okay. I send out an agenda, ask for others to send what they would like to see added. Yes, that's a great suggestion. That's from Denise. A couple more people writing. If revisiting prior agendas counts, then yes, I have a process, but I'm not sure the original was well set out or had a process. Okay. So revisiting prior agendas, adding meeting notes to last agendas. So this same sort of idea of keeping track of things that were covered and not covered. Okay. So most of us, will write agendas for events such as really big conferences, right? Like if you have a 3-day conference, you'll probably write an agenda. If you have multiple sessions going on, if you have multiple faculty participating, you're going to probably have some kind of an agenda. But a lot of times for shorter meetings or smaller meetings, for less people or internal meetings, we don't really do that as much. Which brings me to my next poll, and I'm going to have you guys weigh in on, which is, for instance, do you write agendas for meetings with your OVW program manager? So if we have, Alicia, I think we have a poll for that one too, right? Yeah, thank you. If you guys can just hit yes or no, that do you write agendas for meetings with your OVW program manager? Marie is saying yes in the chat. Thank you. Okay. Okay, so I'm seeing a couple of comments here about not having OBW program managers. So what I mean by that is that for folks who are funded through the Office on Violence Against Women, typically you have some person at the Office on Violence Against Women that would be sort of managing your grant. So if you don't have somebody like that, think about if you have a funder or even just let's think about meetings with a supervisor. Is that a situation where you would create an agenda? And you could just, the poll is closed, so you could just write in. People can just write in yes or no there. No. Okay. Okay. So a couple yeses, one no we have. Okay. So I would invite you to think about writing agendas for all your meetings, large and small, short or long. And it's for a few reasons. First of all, it's to prepare yourself. Basically, it is helpful, I have found in the many years of creating agendas for big workshops, but also for important meetings with funders or meetings with supervisors or board members, to really sit and be intentional about what the needs are that you have for the meeting, and to write objectives for how to accomplish them, and to just have a process to think through what you really want to achieve. And it's important because your time is precious, right? We don't really want to waste our own time. We don't want to waste other people's time. So if we sit and think about what we really need to get out of meetings, I can guarantee that you're going to have a more productive meeting, and you will walk out of there instead of feeling like, oh, great, we just spent another 2 hours of our time, of our workday, in a meeting that went nowhere. Instead, you can really think, okay, well, we got a lot accomplished. We sort of met the objectives for what we were trying to do. The other reason is to prepare other people who are coming. So one of you mentioned that you will send out your agendas in advance, right? That's a great practice to have, to write your agenda and to send it to folks that are going to be at your meeting. Why? Because if it's a type of thing where people don't necessarily have to be at the meeting, maybe they see your agenda and they realize, oh, I'm not the right person for this meeting. I should be sending my program specialist. I should be sending my executive director, that kind of a thing. Or maybe it's so that people can weigh in on the subject matter and say, oh, I think we should also cover XYZ topic, or I think we should spend more time on such and such a topic. In addition to that, it's really helpful to craft an agenda to memorialize conversations you've had or you're intending to have and decisions that you're going to be making. Part of that is, again, when we think about conversations with a funder, like the Office on Violence Against Women, or with people internally, like board members or other staff or supervisors, it's important for us to keep careful track of the conversations we're having, decisions we're making around our work. It could also be helpful for when you go back and start to do grant reporting, if you have progress reports and things like that that you have to complete on a regular basis. Agendas help you to stay on task and on time. We already mentioned this, the idea about getting approval or feedback. And Brianne mentioned at the beginning the idea around conference approval forms, or the CAF. So for those of us who are funded through the Office on Violence Against Women and do trainings, we are often in the business of creating the conference approval form. So raise your hand if you've ever created or had to submit a conference approval form. So you use the little guy at the top. Okay, so that's something that a lot of people have in common. I saw a bunch of hands go up. The conference approval form, for those of you who have not done it, is a pretty in-depth form that you have to fill out several months before you have any kind of in-person training event, right? And so it's really important, and this is something I've talked to OVW about, as well as even within my own organization, to think through your agendas very carefully before you submit a conference approval form. So one of the things you need for a conference approval form is the actual agenda, right? But sometimes we are doing it so far in advance that we think, you know, I don't really know exactly what the agenda is going to look like for this event that I'm having in 6 months. So, you know, I have sort of a vague idea what's going to be at this meeting, so I'll just throw it together in the agenda, right? Well, the trouble with that is you can't really critically create a picture of what's going to happen at that workshop or at that meeting without really going through the agenda. And that should really be the first thing you do before you fill out the conference approval form, because so many of the items in your conference approval form are dependent on that agenda, right? So things like allotting for any consultants and faculty you're going to have. How long are you going to have this meeting for? Is it going to be 2 days or 2.5 days? What kind of a setup are you going to need? How will you know that you're going to need to budget for instance, breakout rooms if you haven't done a detailed agenda yet, right? The other sort of pitfall of not really thinking through your agenda in advance of submitting a conference approval form is that you may get approved for your meeting or your workshop based on the agenda you submit, and then when it comes time to actually have your event, your agenda looks very different. And that's not something that is really, it's not something that the Office on Violence Against Women is fond of if you're going to have an agenda that looks drastically different by the time you have your event. So, and you may have to submit it again and have conversations around it. So it's important just to think through in advance what you really want to put in that agenda. Okay, so in the beginning of the webinar, I mentioned that we have a worksheet that's called the Agenda Development Worksheet. And that's something that I created under our ILED project to help people think through a process for creating agendas. So you will see right here at the top of the Agenda Development Worksheet that there's some room to just write down the name of your program or your meeting, what the date is it going to be something that's in person? Is it going to be something that you do on a webinar or on the phone? Who is your audience? And is this going to be a formal or an informal meeting, right? So that's all just sort of basic logistic type information. And then the first real substantive thing for you to think about is what is the goal of your meeting? So before we really talk about that, let's think about what I even mean by a goal. So we have here a little cloud bubble or a thought bubble on our agenda development worksheet. And it says goal of meeting, and the word goal has an underline under GO. And that's because the word goal has the word go in it. It means where are you trying to go? What are you trying to achieve, right? What is the purpose of the convening? What is the big picture of this particular event that you're holding? Goals can be broad. They could be general. They don't have to be specific. They are general intentions towards the attainment of something. So they can and should be aspirational. So as an example, I might say that I want to lose 20 pounds. That's my goal. I don't really need to define when or where or how I'm going to lose 20 pounds. I just know that that's what I want to do, and that's my goal. So when we're thinking about our meetings, we can have, initially, we should have a big picture goal, and that should be the first thing that we think about when we're designing our agenda. Now, the second part is probably the most important part of this whole process. And this process, I'm going to add, is very similar to the process that we use at ILED to design curriculum. So if you are, it's an abbreviated process because it's for, for meetings, so it's a sort of a shorter term endeavor. But it's very similar. The steps are very similar to the steps that we use when we design curriculum. So that could be for a one-day training program or a 5-day training program. It's sort of a similar process. So when you figure out what your goal is, the next step is to really think about what are the topics or items that must be addressed to meet the goal. So as an example, let's decide for purposes of our webinar today that your goal, that you're going to have a meeting, and the goal is that we're going to meet with our funder, our program manager at OVW. And, for those of you who said you don't have a program manager, think then of somebody who is in a decision-making role over some of your work. So whether that be a supervisor or a funder. So let's say we're going to have a meeting with our OVW program manager to discuss and outline our grant deliverables for a new grant that we just received. So we'll imagine that we have a brand new grant that we were given from the Office of Violence Against Women, and we need to discuss and outline what we have to actually do for this grant. What are our deliverables? So assuming that you have to do that to discuss and outline a brand new grant with your program manager, what topics or items do you think you might need to cover? Let's just throw some out there if you'll use the chat and just name some topics or items that you might want to discuss in that type of a meeting. Okay, timeline. Michelle's saying timeline, budget, goals. Yep, those are all great suggestions. Anybody else want to offer anything that you might want to cover in a meeting where you're talking about your deliverables with your funder or supervisor? Hannah is typing. Purpose of using the grant. Okay. Thank you, Hannah. Angela is typing. Housekeeping items. Great. When, where, how, why. Definitely. Success story from past, especially if the same grantor. Okay. Okay, so these are some great, Jess is typing, these are some great suggestions, and some of these we will cover. There are entries in the actual worksheet that we can cover some of these items. and then looking forward to the next grant cycle. Okay, great. So yes, these are all things that you might want to list as topics or items that must be addressed to meet your goal of outlining your deliverables for a 2-year grant. One of the items that were suggested right away by Michelle was timeline. So we're going to keep timeline in mind as we proceed through this process. I'm going to refer back throughout the process to timeline. Okay, so now what we want to do is to write objectives. So objectives are a little bit different than goals, but they are often used interchangeably, okay? You'll often hear people say, you know, what are my goals and objectives? And they think that they're referring to the same thing. But objectives are a little bit different. And to help remember the distinction between objectives and goals, I often mention that the word objective has the word object in it, right? That means that it is specific. It's concrete, like an object. It's something you could hold in your hand. Objectives typically are specific. They are statements that are measurable. They should be statements of something that is achievable and relevant, and they should be able to be completed within a time specific, so time-oriented. So earlier I had mentioned that I wanted to lose 20 pounds, right? That was my goal. So as a goal of wanting to lose 20 pounds, perhaps my objective would be something like, so in order to lose 20 pounds, I am going to limit how much sugar I eat. I'm going to exercise 30 minutes a day, and I'm going to conduct weekly weigh-ins. As you can see, those are sort of tactics that I'm going to use in order to achieve my goal. When you write objectives, you should use action verbs. Your objectives should be very clear. They should articulate things that another person can see or hear or touch or feel. You want to use action verbs, and you want your statements to be items that very clearly articulate the steps and tactics that you're going to use to achieve your goals. Okay? So as I mentioned in your materials, there is a handout that we've created for ILED, which takes you through in a little bit more detail how to write objectives. And it's something you might want to refer to when you write agendas, but also if you're writing any kind of education programs or if you're doing any kind of seminar or presentation, they can be very helpful. Okay, so let's get a little bit engaged here and think about this writing an objective, right? So if you were to be having a meeting and you were going to be outlining your deliverables for a 2-year grant and you wanted to write a meeting specifically, you wanted to write an objective specifically around timeline. So what is the timeline for this grant and what you're going to be producing? Would somebody care to help me out and write an objective for your meeting? And I will start you off with the sentence, at this meeting we will, and then think about an objective that corresponds to a timeline, corresponds to creating a timeline. Oh, Angela's asking me with regards to losing weight. No, with regards to your meeting that you're having about your deliverables for your grant and talking about the timeline on your grant, what would be an objective? An objective for the topic of timeline. and this is for your meeting with your OVW program specialist or your funder. So Michelle is writing, at this meeting we will create a list of tasks and due dates. Exactly. That's a great, clear objective. It's measurable. We can see that you created a list, right? We'll be able to see it. It can be done within a time certain. It's specific. I know exactly what you're saying. Angela's writing, at this meeting we will learn the timeline needed to complete the goals. Okay. Great. Amanda is typing. Okay. So generally speaking, if you were using this agenda development process, what you would do is look at the topics that you listed, and you will write objectives for your meeting based on those topics. Depending on how specific you have gotten with your list of topics, if your topics are kind of bigger topics, you might want to have just one objective for each of those topics. If you were very, very specific about the topics that you wanted to address in your meeting, it may be that those topics are small enough that more than one of them could be accomplished through a single objective. But in any event, you want to really consider those topics when you're writing your objectives for your agenda. So at that point that you have done this sort of process of thinking about your needs, or your topics rather, and then written these objectives, your length of this meeting that you're going to have will take shape. So if you went into this process knowing that you had to have a meeting with, as we said, your OVW program manager, right, or your supervisor or your funder, you knew you had to have this meeting. You knew you had to deal with a lot of different issues, right, and you made a list of the topics that you had to cover. You wrote some objectives based on those topics. The amount of time you're going to need for the meeting will start to take shape at that point, because you'll be able to see, wow, I have this many objectives. We're covering, 10 needs. We're probably going to need an hour for, to accomplish this objective. We'll probably need an hour and a half to accomplish the next objective. So as you go through this process of thinking through the needs and then writing objectives based on those needs, the duration of the meeting will become pretty readily apparent. This is also on this form where you might want to start thinking about things like pre-meeting tasks. So what do you think I mean by a pre-meeting task? Does anybody want to write in to the chat what I might mean by that? Collecting information that will be important for all attendees to have. Great, definitely. An annotated agenda, Michelle is writing. Great. Annotated agendas are very helpful, and actually at all of our in-person workshops, we utilize annotated agendas to make sure that all of the folks that are leading have a really detailed plan of what we're covering. Denise is saying research items to be discussed, get a room, refreshments, send invites. Wonderful. Those are all great, great answers. Preparation needing to be done for the meeting, what's to be discussed at the meeting, materials that should be previewed prior to the meeting, great. And Kara is also saying reading that should be completed beforehand. Yeah, so these are all great suggestions. So some of the items that I was thinking about, some of them you've already named, was gathering any kind of material that you might want your participants to have read in advance. So let's say if you are having a meeting with your program manager and your partners, for instance, on your grant. You might want to share copies of your special conditions that are on your grant or the terms of your grant to everyone who's going to be at that meeting. You'll want to obviously invite people to the meeting. You want to locate a space if you're going to have the meeting in person. If you're going to have the meeting on the phone, you're going to want to arrange for telephone numbers or for a webinar platform. You need to determine whether or not you have to submit a conference approval form to OVW if it's going to be a live meeting. You'll want to think about any kind of accessibility needs also that you might have for the meeting. So there's a spot on our worksheet right above for accessibility considerations. So as an example, if you are having a meeting in person, you want to make sure that you have located a location, a venue, a hotel that is accessible to people who may have a disability. You may have to create materials in large font or in Braille. You may need an interpreter, right? So these are all accessibility considerations and pre-meeting tasks that you might want to think about. Okay. So continuing on in the tool, we now have a goal. We have objectives. We have topics that we want to cover. We have an idea of about how long we may need for this meeting, and we have an idea of what we need to do in advance beforehand. So if you look at page 3 of the Agenda Development Worksheet, or here on the screen, on the slide, I have a screenshot of it, you will see that the tool is even further broken down by topics so that you can really think about the segments of your meeting and any kind of notes that you might want to take to prepare for the individual segments or pieces of your meeting. So if we were having an all-day meeting, right, and you had 4 objectives that you wanted to accomplish in that all-day meeting, you might break down the day according to those objectives. So you may have 2 hours of the day be committed to that first objective or that first topic that you named. And you can use this worksheet to think through who is the responsible party for leading the discussion, but also for, excuse me, for leading the discussion, but also for accomplishing whatever needs to be done during that time at the meeting. So if you were holding the meeting by a web call, for instance, maybe one person is facilitating that call, but maybe you have another person who's helping to deal with the technology of that call. So you want to maybe list those things here as the responsible party. You can take a look at tasks and think about how are you going to accomplish the objective of this particular topic. Like, what kinds of activities will you use? So are you simply going to have sit around a table and have a small group discussion, which works fine. Maybe you will all gather around with your the terms of your grant and your calendars and your award and just have a discussion. But if you're doing it on a web call, perhaps you want to accomplish this objective in a different way because it's a little harder to have interactive conversation in a free-flowing way on a web call. So maybe you want to designate how you're going to discuss the material in a little bit more of an intentional way. Maybe you're going to call on people and go round robin and have a list of people and ask for people to weigh in one after the other or something like that. So this is just a space for you to think about how are we going to accomplish the objective, and then to think through what is the follow-up that will be needed, and to think through any challenges that may arise during this portion of the meeting. So what might we mean by that? What kind of challenges? You know, it could be anything, really, right? You may have technology challenges that could come up if you're doing a meeting remotely, or even if you're using technology at a meeting in person. So you might want to think through some solutions to that. Maybe we'll have a backup plan. We'll make sure we also have materials on paper, that kind of a thing. Other challenges that may arise, maybe they are relationship-type challenges. Maybe this is your meeting, to use our example of meeting with our OVW specialist, perhaps you have a partner in this grant, and there's been a little bit of history where accomplishing the objectives of the grant have been difficult, and maybe that's something that may come up in the meeting, and maybe you want to think through that and think about what are some ways that you might deal with that in advance. What are some solutions that you can take in order to deal with any kind of challenges that might arise when you're actually at that meeting? So those are the main pieces of this tool, and those are the main elements of the process that we use for designing an agenda. So why use a tool like this? Why even bother to use a tool like this? If anybody wants to put something in the chat. Jess is saying spending time on the front end of a project planning will often save time in the long run. Absolutely. I agree with that. To make your meetings as engaging and worthwhile as possible. Absolutely. To be as efficient as possible and utilizing the limited time that we have. Definitely. How often do we go to meetings, as I said at the beginning of this webinar, and how many times do we go to meetings and think, wow, I just spent 2 hours of my life I'll never get back, right? We want our meetings to be productive. Nicole said to have actions come out of your meetings. Absolutely. That's why I like to use that tool to make note of follow-up and who's going to do it. That's really important because I know for myself I'm often working on lots of different things all at once, and I may think during a meeting that I'm going to remember in 2 months that it was me who was supposed to follow up on a specific item, or that it was my colleague that was supposed to follow up, but really it's hard to remember those things when we're doing so much. And Michelle wrote, so that you will actually prepare for all the things that might come up. Also make sure that you don't forget all the things that feel obvious while you're thinking about it, but forget when you get in front of people. I think that's a great answer, Michelle. Absolutely. I think for me, in using the tool, that piece around challenges that might come up that piece is really important, because there's really nothing worse than being at a meeting and having stuff go wrong, especially if you're facilitating the meeting and you're nervous already, and just being kind of caught out there without really having thought in advance about how you might deal with some of the things that come up. And it's also, I think that the other piece of this is the idea of writing an agenda. It feels like it should be just sort of natural, right? Like where you don't really need a process for it. But coming up with a meeting or hosting a meeting, facilitating a meeting, there's a lot involved. And so part of the benefit of using a process, it doesn't have to be this process, but something similar to this, is that not only are you thinking through substantively what are we going to cover in this meeting so that we're using our time efficiently, but you're also thinking of all those other extra things that you have to do to make sure the meeting is a success, to make sure that what you agreed to actually happens afterwards, right, with any kind of follow-up, to make sure that you can look back and see what was decided, why it was decided. I find for me, when I use this tool, I can attach it later on after a meeting to the actual official agenda, right, that I would distribute to folks, right, because you're not going to distribute your tool, you would distribute a formal agenda. But I will combine the two, so if I have to go back and look, I can say, oh, okay, this is what I was hoping to do here, and this is why I put this in here, right? So you can see a little bit more of your thought process. Kara wrote in, respectful, professional, to have a process and set an agenda. Good leadership. Yeah, I think that that's true. I think it's very important to be respectful of each other's time. And in the kind of work that we all do, our time is so important, and there's so much of what we do that is difficult, that is enervating, that is can be emotional. And so the time that we spend together when we're trying to make important decisions, we should really take the time to make that process as smooth as possible. And really the essence of doing that is in planning. I do believe that. So this, we have about 10-15 minutes for questions. Folks can use the chat to ask any questions about this process or about meeting design or about ILED or anything that you would like to ask, if you have any questions. I think another benefit to using a process like this is that it will help you create more accurate agendas for your conference approval forms, so that when you actually get to the work of creating your conference or your meeting, you don't look back at your conference approval form agenda and find that it doesn't reflect anything of your needs at all, or that it's substantively at odds with what you're actually planning to do in a way that might raise red flags for you with your funder or with our funder. So I think it is helpful, especially for that process. Nicole is typing, so I'm just going to. See if there are any questions. Okay. I see some people typing. Thank you all so much for being here today. Please feel free to contact me at any time. I see a question up here. A couple of issues I run into during meetings is individuals do not do the prep work, and some meetings can get really off topic and lose focus. Is this a good design to help lessen this? I think so. I mean, I think one of the things, especially, somebody mentioned at the beginning of this process, at the beginning of the webinar rather, the idea of being collaborative around designing agendas. And so I think what you could do, especially if it's something where a couple of people are responsible for a meeting, you could use this type of a form in advance of doing the agenda and think through together collaboratively what are some of the needs, what are some of the topics that we want to cover, who's going to be responsible, and fill it out as a team in a collaborative way so that by the time you get to the agenda writing, you're already on board. Like folks are already down to move forward in a way that's sort of a shared vision. So I think this would be a helpful tool for that type of a process. Thank you. Thanks, Nicole. How far in advance is ideal to send prep materials? Long enough that they don't get set aside and lost, but long enough that people have time and don't have to disregard other tasks to cram. So that's a good question. How long in advance to send materials? You know, I think that it really depends on how much work you are requiring of people. So I think if you are giving people items to read through, and especially if they're dense items, I would give people at least 2 weeks to go through that. I would say minimum of 2 weeks. If it's just an agenda and you want people to weigh in, if it's a short agenda, if it's a short meeting, it would probably be okay to send it a week in advance. But I think a week is a good amount of time for a short agenda where you're not needing people to weigh in a lot or do a lot of prep work. But I think if folks have to do prep work, you want to give them at least 2 weeks or more. That's sort of, it's not a hard and fast rule certainly, but I would err on the side of giving at least 2 weeks. And since, you know, for most of us who are operating on OVW grants, right, since most of the time we need to have like 30 days approval anyway, it's probably best to give yourself a fair chunk of time, right, to get things out and to give people a chance. Any other questions? Those are great questions. Okay. So feel free to contact me at my email address, which is up here, jwhite@futureswithoutviolence.org. That's the best way to get in touch with me. And, you know, we do a lot of work, as I said, around faculty development, facilitation skills, also curriculum design. That's kind of my favorite of the courses is the curriculum design course, which we actually have coming up in October, and that will be, it's in the process of being approved by OVW. It'll most likely be in Portland, Oregon. So keep an eye out for registration materials for that. I would love to see some of you at our curriculum development workshop if you're interested, and hopefully I will meet with you again virtually in another one of these meetings. Thank you so much.